There is a watch in this video that costs $20 and keeps better time than a $5,000 mechanical Rolex. That is not an opinion, and it is not a provocation. It's physics. A quartz crystal oscillates 32,000 times a second, and a balance wheel swings about 4. One of those is more precise, and it isn't the expensive one. The watch industry has spent a century training you not to notice that. It has taught you that price signals quality, that a heavier watch is a better watch, and that the difference between $300 and 3,000 lives in the object rather than in the marketing budget behind it. Most of the time, that isn't true. And there are a handful of watches, sold for the price of a dinner, that make it obvious enough to be uncomfortable. 7 watches almost everyone walks straight past. Number 7. 7. Casio F-91W. Around 20 ohm. Plastic case, plastic strap, a little digital display, and a shape so recognizable it functions as a logo. It weighs about 21 grams, which means you genuinely forget it's on your wrist. 35 millimeters across, 8.5 thick. It looks like a school watch, because for a very large number of people, it was one. Here is the specification the industry does not want compared directly against its own products. 7 years of battery life. Read that again, because you have been trained not to notice it. 7 years, in a $20 watch, running a stopwatch, a daily alarm, an hourly chime, and an auto calendar at the same time. There is a mechanical watch in a shop window right now, costing $4,000 that needs servicing every 5 years at several hundred a time. This one asks nothing of you for 7. Then costs a few dollars for a cell. Casio has been building this exact watch since 1989, not a successor, not a modernized version, the same watch, continuously, for over 3 decades, which means every failure mode it could possibly have was found and fixed before most people watching this were born. And there's something that only happens with objects this cheap and this reliable. An enormous modification community grew up around it. People fitting steel cases, custom straps, different bezels, turning a $20 Casio into something personal. That exists for exactly one reason. Experimenting with it costs nothing and risks nothing. You cannot say that about anything else you can buy. One honest limitation: the water resistance is basic. Rain and hand washing, yes. Swimming, no. If you want water, we get to that at number 1. And if a $20 plastic watch outlasting a $4,000 mechanical bothers you, the next one is on a steel bracelet. 6. Casio A158WA. Around 20 to 35. Here's something that should not exist at this price point: a stainless steel bracelet, a chrome-plated case, an LED backlight, a stopwatch, all on a watch that costs less than lunch for 2. The A158 sits on the shelf directly beside Casio's famous plastic digital, and almost everybody reaches past it for the plastic one. That's a mistake, and it comes down to one component: the bracelet. Pick one up. There is a thickness to the links that has no business existing at this money. Not the hollow-formed kind that flexes when you squeeze it, but a tapered 3-link bracelet with actual material in it. It's the reason this watch has a quiet following among people who own considerably better things. And there's a practical dimension that matters more than it sounds. A leather strap has a buckle and a hole you have to find, and it cracks and needs replacing every couple of years. A metal bracelet has a clasp you fold once, and it never wears out. That's a small daily friction removed, and small daily frictions are how watches end up abandoned in drawers. The case is around 33 millimeters, which is smaller than most modern watches. That works in its favor. It sits flat, it doesn't catch on a cuff, and it doesn't look like a dinner plate parked on your forearm. Casio launched this design in the late 80s and has barely needed to touch it since, which tells you how well it was resolved the first time. One warning worth taking seriously: this model is among the most counterfeited watches in the world, precisely because it looks like metal and costs nothing. Buy from Casio directly, or from a seller shipping genuine Casio stock. A fake will fail, And then you'll conclude Casios are rubbish when the problem was the seller. The next watch runs on light and never needs a battery at all. Number 5. Citizen BM8180 Garrison. Around 110. Picture someone who's worn the same beaten-up digital watch for 3 years, finally decides to buy something analog and respectable, sets a hard budget of $100, and walks into a watch shop. They do not walk out with this. They walk out with a basic quartz from whichever brand the salesperson mentioned, because the Citizen solar watches are on the opposite wall and nobody is pointing at them. There's no margin story to tell about them. That's the Garrison's entire problem. Nobody makes the case for it. So here it is. It runs on Citizen's EcoDrive, a solar movement with a thin film cell beneath the dial that converts any light source, daylight, or a table lamp into stored charge. Fully powered, it runs for months in complete darkness. There is no battery to replace. Not in 3 years. Not in 10. Not ever. Now think about what that actually solves, because it isn't convenience. It's abandonment. A standard quartz battery lasts 2 or 3 years. It dies. You need to take the watch somewhere, and that means finding a jeweler, driving there, leaving it, going back. It's a small errand. But the honest truth is that most watches die in a drawer, not because they broke, but because nobody got round to the errand. Remove the errand, and the watch simply stays in use. Permanently. The rest of the package earns its place too. 100 meters of water resistance. A 37mm case, which sounds small until you notice most people with ordinary wrists are buying 42mm watches because that's what the industry pushed, not because that's what fits. And an olive nylon strap that looks like it came off a field watch costing 5 times more. EcoDrive launched in the mid-70s. Citizen has been refining it for roughly 50 years, in-house, at a scale nobody else matches at this price. This is not a gimmick bolted onto a cheap watch. The next one is the watch that turned more people into collectors than anything else in this hobby. 4. Seiko 5 SNK 809. Around 110 to 150. Pull the collection histories of serious collectors, people with grand Seikos in rotation, vintage pieces they don't mention casually, and ask what they started with. A disproportionate number name this. 37mm. Canvas strap. Seiko's own automatic movement inside. 21 joules. No hacking and no hand winding. The accuracy is loose by any objective standard. The power reserve is around 40 hours. None of that is why it's here. The SNK is the watch that taught an entire generation what an automatic movement actually feels like. Not as a concept you've read about, but as a physical thing. There's a weighted rotor inside that spins when your arm swings, and you can feel it through the case back if you press your thumb against the glass. The second hand doesn't tick once per second like a quartz watch. It sweeps continuously because the movement beats several times a second, and the hand follows that rhythm without pausing. Nobody who puts a real automatic on their wrist for the first time and watches that sweep forgets it. For an enormous number of people, this Seiko is where it happened, and the canvas strap does something most straps don't. It comes stiff from the factory and breaks in over about 3 weeks of daily wear, softening until it sits against your wrist as though it were cut for it specifically. Now, the practical note, and it matters. Seiko has wound this line down. Prices have drifted up, and availability varies considerably by seller. What was an $85 watch a few years ago now trades between $110 and $150, and rising. That is what happens when enough people work out what something is. The next watch has an in-house movement at a price that embarrasses the entire Swiss industry. 3. Orient Mako 2 Kamasu. Around 160. 41.5mm. 200 meters of water resistance. A unidirectional rotating bezel. A signed crown. And a date window with a rim around it. A small detail most watches at this price forget entirely, and one you can never unnotice once someone points it out. But the part that matters is inside, and it is the single most under-discussed fact in affordable watchmaking. The movement in this watch is Orient's own. Not a Miyota, not an ETA, not a clone of either. Their own design, built in their own facility, with hacking and manual winding on top of automatic winding, features most competitors delete at this price to protect margin. Now hold that against how the industry talks. In-house movement is one of the most heavily marketed phrases in watchmaking. Brands put it in the first line of the press release and charge 4 figures for the privilege. It's used as proof of seriousness, of legitimacy, of belonging. Orient does it and charges $160 and says almost nothing about it. The reason is structural. Orient is owned by Seiko Epson, and they've been building their own calibers for decades at industrial scale. They can do at this price what other brands can only do at 4 figures. And they have no marketing department invested in convincing you it's special. So here's the uncomfortable observation. Orient is an in-house movement manufacturer, pricing its watches below what many competitors charge for movements those competitors did not design. The pattern among owners is consistent enough to be funny. People buy one as a placeholder, something to wear while saving for something serious. Years later, they own the serious watch and still reach for the Orient on Saturdays. Not because the expensive one is too precious to wear, but because this one turned out to be too good to retire. The next watch costs more than everything so far, and carries 170 years behind it. 2. Timex Marlin Automatic, 40mm, $299 list. The original Marlin appeared in the mid-60s. It was the dress watch for people who needed to look like they cared without spending money they didn't have. Teachers, office workers, young men in their first suit. There's a reasonable chance you or your father owned one. Timex brought it back in 2017, first as a hand wound reissue, then as this, the automatic, in 40mm. $299 on Timex's own list. And it sells for considerably less when Timex runs a sale, which is often. What you're getting for that is a Miyota automatic, 21 jewels, around 40 hours of reserve, built by Citizen's Movement Division in Japan. And here's where the argument gets pointed. Because that same movement family powers watches sold by brands charging well into 4 figures. Identical engine, different name on the dial. The Marlin gets it for under $300. The physical execution earns attention too. The case is polished and brushed 316L steel, 40mm across and 13 thick, and it's curved to sit against a wrist rather than perch on top of it like a disc. That's more engineering consideration than plenty of automatics at 3 times the price bother with. If you've ever taken a watch off because it kept snagging on a shirt cuff, that's exactly what this solves. The dial is what a dress watch dial should be. Arabic numerals, clean hands, high contrast, no date window to squint at, nothing decorative in the way. The honest limitations: 30 meters of water resistance. So rain and hand washing are fine and swimming isn't. The crown doesn't screw down. Mineral crystal, not sapphire. But there's context most reviews skip. Timex has been making watches since the 1850s. They survived the quartz crisis by building inexpensive quartz watches, while Swiss houses were closing or being absorbed. They survived the digital era and the smartwatch boom by refusing to compete with either. They just kept making watches for people who wanted a watch. That's 170 years of knowing what a watch needs to do, and doing it without charging you for the story. And the #1 watch on this list costs less than half of it, with engineering nobody else has ever had. Number 1. Vostok Amphibia. Around $90. In the late 1960s, the Soviet Ministry of Defense needed a dive watch for naval frogmen. They went to the Chistopol watch factory, the same factory that had been evacuated out of Moscow by horse cart in 1941, when German forces were 3 weeks from the city. Thousands of carts hauled equipment across a frozen river to keep it alive. That is what this $90 watch descends from. The engineers at Chistopol had a problem. They could not replicate the case construction Swiss dive watches used. The machining tolerances required for a conventional screw-down crown with proper depth sealing were beyond what their equipment could achieve consistently at volume. So they solved it from a completely different direction. They engineered a case where external water pressure actively helps seal the watch instead of threatening to breach it. The crystal is slightly flexible acrylic. The caseback is a bayonet fitting. The deeper you go, the harder the water pushes the seals inward, tightening the watch around itself. 200 meters of water resistance, achieved not by copying anyone, but by attacking the problem sideways, because copying wasn't available. Swiss watchmakers at the time called the approach crude. In one narrow sense, they weren't wrong. The finishing isn't fine. Movement accuracy varies between units more than it should. The bracelet on some versions is the weakest part of the package, but the watch has been in continuous production for close to 60 years. The pressure-sealed case still works at depth, and you can buy a new one today for around $90. When the Soviet Union collapsed and state contracts evaporated overnight, the factory adapted to private ownership and kept making amphibious. Because what else do you do when your main product has been validated by decades of naval divers? Here's why it takes number one, and it isn't the price or the history. There are maybe 24 genuinely original engineering ideas in affordable watchmaking. Almost every cheap watch is a simplified version of an expensive one. Fewer jewels, worse finishing, cheaper crystal, same basic architecture. The Amphibia is not a simplified anything. It is an original solution to a real problem, arrived at by people who could not afford to copy the answer everyone else was using. Everything else on this list is a good watch made cheaply. This is a good idea that happens to be cheap, and in 60 years, nobody else has had it. Look back at what these 7 have in common, because it isn't the price. Not one of them is cheap because a corner was cut somewhere you'd notice. A Casio with a 7-year battery. A Citizen that never needs one at all. An in-house automatic movement for $160. A Soviet dive case that solved a problem Switzerland solved differently and more expensively. They're cheap because of where they sit in a market that decided some time ago that price is supposed to signal quality, and then kept charging accordingly whether or not the object earned it. The industry would rather you didn't line them up like this. So, which of these did you write off before watching? One you'd dismissed and then realized you'd been wrong about? Drop it below. And if you've owned any of them for years, I especially want to know how it held up. A decade of actual ownership beats anything I can read off a spec sheet. If this was useful, hit subscribe. There's a video on the channel about the expensive watches dealers genuinely cannot sell, and it's the exact opposite of this one.